The lights in the studio were dimmed, and the camera zoomed in on Jason Statham, seated confidently in the center of the set. His muscular frame and piercing gaze filled the screen, commanding attention from everyone in the room. He was known for his roles in action-packed thrillers, but tonight he was here to talk about something unexpected, something that had everyone curious. "Jason," the interviewer said, leaning forward with a slight smile, "you've made a name for yourself in Hollywood as an action star. But tonight, we're not talking about car chases or fight scenes. We're talking about Disney's latest live-action adaptation of Snow White." The screen behind them flickered to life, showing clips from the recently released movie, a reimagined Snow White, a stark contrast to the familiar, innocent princess everyone knew from the classic animation. The interviewer's voice cut through the silence as the camera panned to Statham. "What did you think about the film? Was it what you expected?" For a moment, Statham's expression was unreadable. He leaned back in his chair, his eyes scanning the clips on the screen. The room was quiet, waiting for his response. Then, with a slow exhale, he spoke. "Well," he began, his deep voice cutting through the tension, "it was definitely a surprise. But not the kind I was hoping for." The interviewer raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean by that?" Jason leaned forward slightly, his gaze locked on the camera. "The problem with Snow White isn't just the story, it's what Disney tried to do with it. They made these huge changes, trying to modernize a classic, but in doing so, they missed what made the original work in the first place." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. The studio audience sat in rapt attention. This wasn't the response they'd expected from the action star, who usually reserved his opinions for the world of high-octane movies. "Wait, so you're saying the changes were a problem?" the interviewer asked, intrigued. "Absolutely," Statham replied, his tone sharp. "Look, I get it. Times change and movies need to evolve. But when you're dealing with something as iconic as Snow White, you can't just throw out what made the story resonate with people. Snow White, in the original, wasn't just a pretty princess. She was a symbol of kindness, vulnerability, and purity. They tried to turn her into this warrior-like figure, and that's where they went wrong." The interviewer nodded slowly. "So you're saying the film's attempt at empowerment didn't land well with you?" "Not just with me," Statham said, his voice firm. "With a lot of people. There's a reason people loved the old Snow White. She wasn't perfect. She was relatable. Now they've turned her into something she wasn't meant to be. And that disconnect, that's what people are reacting to." The tension in the room was palpable. The film, which had been touted as one of Disney's next big hits, was now being torn apart by one of Hollywood's biggest stars. "Well," the interviewer said, trying to steer the conversation forward, "the movie's been getting mixed reviews. What do you think was the biggest issue? Was it the casting, the story, or something else?" Jason Statham took a deep breath and exhaled slowly. "It's a combination of things, but one of the biggest problems is the way they marketed the movie. It didn't connect with the audience on the emotional level that the original did. Disney forgot that it's not just about looking good on screen, it's about telling a story that people can believe in." The audience remained silent, hanging on his every word. Jason had no filter. His straightforward, no-nonsense attitude was one of the things fans admired most about him, and tonight it was on full display. "All right, Jason," the interviewer continued, "we're going to dive deeper into what went wrong with Snow White. But before we do, we've got a quick question from the audience." The camera zoomed in on a young woman in the crowd. "Jason, do you think Disney will learn from this? Can they fix it in the future?" Jason paused, his brow furrowed slightly. "Honestly, I hope so. But they've got to stop trying to fix what isn't broken. Classic stories like Snow White don't need to be rewritten. They just need to be reintroduced in a way that feels true to their roots while still being fresh for new audiences." The crowd murmured in agreement, and the interviewer nodded thoughtfully. "Well, you've definitely given us a lot to think about, Jason. Stick around because we're going to dive into exactly why Snow White fell short and what went wrong." Statham gave a slight nod, his eyes still focused on the screen. The room was filled with an air of anticipation as the conversation shifted, but it was clear. Tonight's discussion would leave a lasting impact on how audiences viewed Disney's most recent live-action flop. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from, the interviewer said with a smile, trying to lighten the mood. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? As the cameras rolled, Jason Statham leaned back in his chair, his arms crossed over his chest. The tension in the air had only increased after his blunt assessment of Disney's Snow White. The interviewer, sensing an opportunity to dig deeper, jumped right into the heart of the issue. "So, Jason," the interviewer began, "you've already pointed out some major flaws in the film's direction. But let's dive into the specifics. What do you think were the core reasons this movie didn't meet expectations?" Jason's eyes narrowed as he gave a quick, measured reply. "Well, it's not just one thing. It's a combination of choices that just didn't come together." He looked directly at the interviewer, his voice steady. "First off, Disney made a huge mistake by trying to reinvent Snow White. The original Snow White story worked because it was simple, yet profound. They didn't need to make her a fierce, independent warrior. She was already a strong character, in her own way. What they did was turn her into something she wasn't. And when you change the core of a beloved character, you lose the essence of why people love them in the first place." The interviewer nodded, jotting down notes. "That's a pretty strong take. But many people were excited about the idea of a more empowered Snow White, especially with the non-Me Too movement and the push for more modern, relatable female characters. Don't you think that's something people wanted to see?" Jason didn't hesitate. "Sure, people want to see strong female characters, don't get me wrong. But there's a difference between creating a strong female character and completely rewriting the DNA of an iconic figure. Snow White wasn't about being physically strong or fierce. It was about her resilience, kindness, and hope. Those qualities made her a timeless character. Trying to make her into something else just doesn't work." He paused for a moment, clearly trying to choose his next words carefully. "I'm all for strong women in film, but I don't think Snow White was the right character to turn into. Say warrior princess. And I'm not saying that the actress wasn't talented. I'm saying that Disney missed the mark in terms of character development." The interviewer, clearly intrigued by Jason's perspective, pressed on. "But what about the casting? A lot of fans were divided on the choice of Rachel Zegler as Snow White. Do you think the casting was a factor in the film's reception?" Jason's jaw tightened slightly. "Casting is huge. And no disrespect to Rachel Zegler. She's a talented actress. But here's the problem. The casting didn't match the character they were trying to create. Snow White in the original had an innocence and a purity that resonated with people. I don't think the casting was wrong. I think the role itself was the issue. They forced this character into a mold that didn't fit." The interviewer nodded, taking in his words. "So you're saying it wasn't just the actress, but the way the character was reimagined?" "Exactly," Jason replied, leaning forward, his voice gaining intensity. "So it's not about the actress, it's about the vision. Disney didn't understand what made Snow White special in the first place. They thought they could modernize her and give her this new persona, but in doing so, they stripped away the very elements that made her resonate with audiences for generations." Jason shook his head slowly. "And let's not even get started on the changes to the story itself." The interviewer raised an eyebrow. "You're referring to the alterations in the plot?" "Yeah," Jason said, his tone blunt. "Look, I get that we're in a time where people want fresh takes on old stories, but Snow White is a fairy tale. It has a structure. It has a flow. The movie tried to reinvent the wheel, and in doing so it lost what made the story magical. They shifted the focus away from Snow White's relationship with the dwarfs and made the story more about her rebellion against the Queen. It just didn't have the same charm anymore." He leaned back in his chair, clearly frustrated. "You can't just change the entire plot of a beloved classic and expect people to buy into it. The magic of Snow White is in the simplicity of the story. It's the same reason why people still watch the original animation. It's timeless. You can't mess with that without losing something crucial." The interviewer, now clearly fascinated by Jason's insights, posed the next question. "So what's the biggest takeaway here? Why do you think this movie has received such negative reviews?" Jason paused for a moment, then gave a thoughtful response. It comes down to two things, expectation and execution. Fans had expectations based on the original Snow White, and Disney didn't deliver on those. They gave us a film that was trying too hard to be something it wasn't. And when you do that, you not only disappoint longtime fans, but you also alienate a new audience that doesn't know what to expect. He sighed, his eyes scanning the set as if recalling the disappointing reception the movie had gotten. And don't even get me started on the marketing. The way Disney hyped up this film, promising a fresh new take on Snow White, just didn't line up with what audiences got. They didn't sell the movie properly. When you're promoting something as a reimagined classic, you better make sure it actually feels like a classic. Jason looked directly at the interviewer. People felt let down because the movie didn't live up to the hype, and that's why it's struggling at the box office. There was a heavy silence in the room as Statham's words lingered in the air. The interviewer glanced down at their notes, looking for the next question to ask, but it was clear that Jason had laid out the reasons for the film's failure in stark terms. The audience had already begun to form their own opinions, and it was becoming evident that Disney's Snow White was in deep trouble. "Well, Jason," the interviewer finally said, breaking the silence, "it looks like we've got a lot to unpack here, but there's still so much to discuss, including the box office numbers and fan reactions. Stay tuned, folks, as we dive deeper into why Snow White didn't meet the mark." As the camera zoomed out, Jason Statham remained in his seat, his expression unchanged. The growing conflict surrounding Disney's Snow White was far from over, and it was clear that the conversation was only getting started. The discussion had only just begun, and the ripples of Jason Statham's blunt assessment of Snow White were already spreading. The film, which had been one of Disney's most anticipated releases in years, was beginning to look like an undeniable flop. The movie had promised a fresh take on a beloved fairy tale, but the audience's reaction had been far from what Disney had hoped for. Jason's words were cutting through the surface-level conversation, exposing deeper problems within the film's production and its handling of the Snow White legacy. As the interview continued, the focus shifted to what Disney could have done differently. The interviewer turned back to Jason, eager to explore the potential solutions. "All right, Jason," they began, "we've heard your thoughts on what went wrong with the character and story, but let's talk about the bigger picture. Could Disney have done anything to salvage this movie? Could it have been saved?" Jason sat up straighter, his face more animated now. This was the moment to talk about potential fixes, and he wasn't going to hold back. "You can't just salvage a movie like this once it's already been made," Jason said firmly, his voice low but steady. "I mean, sure, there are ways to improve it, but in the case of Snow White, I think the damage was already done before they even started filming. The film had a fundamental flaw right from the get-go. It didn't understand what made the original Snow White so special." The interviewer, sensing an opportunity to dive deeper into the specifics, asked, "So you don't think Disney should have gone ahead with the live-action remake in the first place?" Jason gave a slight shrug. "Look, I'm not saying every remake is a bad idea. But with something like Snow White, which is already a classic, maybe they should have focused more on honoring the original rather than trying to modernize it into something it wasn't. The audience wasn't asking for a complete overhaul. They were asking for a story that felt familiar but fresh, and that's the part Disney missed." As the conversation continued, Jason began to unravel the idea of what could have been done differently. They could have kept the core themes intact while still incorporating modern sensibilities. Make Snow White more relatable for today's audience without turning her into something unrecognizable. The key is subtlety, something Disney's usually great at. Take the live-action Cinderella, for example. They didn't change the character or the essence of the story, they just added layers, gave us a deeper understanding of the characters. That's what Snow White needed, a little depth, not a complete transformation. The interviewer nodded, taking in his words. "But what about the casting of Snow White herself, Rachel Zegler? Do you think a different actress might have helped the film?" Jason thought for a moment before responding. "Look, Rachel Zegler is a talented actress. I'm not here to trash the performers, but the casting choices reflect the film's approach. Snow White is supposed to have a kind of innocence and vulnerability, right? Zegler's portrayal, while strong in some ways, came off as too hardened for the role. That's where the disconnect happened. He leaned forward, emphasizing his point. It's not just about the actress. It's about understanding the character's essence. Snow White is a symbol of purity, hope, and the triumph of kindness. When you cast someone and try to make them into a tough character, it just doesn't fit. The magic of the original. Snow White was that she wasn't the strongest person in the room, but she had the strength of her character. The interviewer, clearly intrigued, followed up with another question. So, you're saying Disney didn't understand the character of Snow White? Jason's eyes softened slightly, as if he were reflecting on something more personal. Exactly. Disney's mistake was not taking the time to understand why Snow White had such a lasting impact. They tried to force a new generation angle, when what they should have done was focus on making her more timeless. They were trying to fix something that wasn't broken. There's nothing wrong with a character who doesn't wield a sword or command an army. Snow White's strength lay in her heart, her ability to stay kind in the face of adversity. If you try to change that, you lose what made her special. The conversation paused for a moment as the interviewer processed his words. They glanced down at their notes, thinking of the next angle to explore. Jason, on the other hand, appeared to be on a roll now. He had made his case for why the film had failed and what Disney could have done to fix it, but there was still more to say. So, Jason, the interviewer asked, shifting gears, what about the film's attempt at special effects and the visuals? Did the CGI and the modern take on the enchanted forest and the Queen's magic add anything to the film? Jason exhaled, his expression clearly showing his displeasure with the film's visual choices. Honestly? No, the special effects were fine on the surface, but it felt like they were using CGI and flashy visuals to distract from the lack of substance. It didn't feel real. It didn't feel like it was rooted in something meaningful. There's a difference between using effects to enhance a story and using them to cover up a weak one. Disney got too caught up in the spectacle. He gestured slightly with his hands, his tone becoming more animated. Take the original animated Snow White. The animation was beautiful, but it wasn't about the visual effects. It was about the story, the characters, and the emotions. Disney got so caught up in making everything shiny and polished that they forgot the most important thing, making sure the story still had heart. No matter how amazing the visuals are, if the audience doesn't care about the characters, they won't care about the effects. Jason paused, letting the weight of his words settle in. And let's not forget about the Queen. You know, in the original, the Queen was truly terrifying in her jealousy and vanity, and that came across even in animation. Here, though, they made her more of a caricature. It was all about the spectacle, and in the end it wasn't believable. The interviewer, now deeply engrossed in the conversation, asked, "So you're saying that Snow White was more style over substance?" Jason nodded, his jaw set. Exactly. Disney's Snow White was all style, no substance. And that's why it didn't land. The story didn't connect with people. There was no emotional resonance. The movie lacked the heart that made the original Disney films so powerful. Jason sat back in his chair, his arms crossed, his eyes scanning the room. The conversation had shifted from what went wrong to why it mattered. Why Disney's Snow White was more than just a box office failure. It was a missed opportunity to revisit a beloved classic with depth and respect. "We're getting into the heart of the issue now," the interviewer said, clearly impressed. "And it sounds like this wasn't just a simple misstep. It's a deeper problem with how Disney is handling its legacy." Jason's gaze was steady. Exactly. It's not just about one movie. It's about understanding the legacy of these stories and treating them with the respect they deserve. And when you fail to do that, you end up with a movie that no one cares about. The room grew quiet as Jason's words settled in, and the interviewer looked directly into the camera. "Stay tuned, folks. The journey is just beginning. We're diving deeper into why Snow White missed the mark and how Disney might and should learn from this mistake. And trust me, this story's far from over." As the interview progressed, Jason Statham's words continued to reverberate through the studio, challenging the very foundation of Disney's latest live-action remake. There was a palpable sense of growing tension among the crew and the audience, watching the discussion unfold. The movie's failure wasn't just a minor hiccup, it had become a symbol of a much larger issue within the entertainment industry. How had Disney, one of the most successful studios in history, missed the mark so badly? Jason's voice, calm yet commanding, broke the silence as he prepared to dive deeper into the emotional undercurrents that made Snow White more than just a failed box office venture. It was a betrayal to fans and a missed opportunity for filmmakers everywhere. The interviewer, sensing the turning point of the conversation, leaned in closer. "Jason," the interviewer asked, "you've been very candid about why the film didn't work. But what about the emotional aspect? There's been a lot of talk about how the film's lack of emotional depth turned people off. Can you elaborate on that?" Jason's face softened slightly, and his eyes narrowed as he considered the question. "Emotions are everything in storytelling. I don't care if it's a fairy tale or an action movie. If you don't make the audience feel something, you've lost them. And that's exactly what happened here. Disney didn't just miss the mark with the plot or character choices. They missed the emotional core that made Snow White endure for generations." He leaned forward, his voice gaining a more intense quality. "When you watch the original Snow White, there's a rawness to it. You feel her pain, her sadness, her resilience. You're rooting for her innocence and hope. It's timeless. But in this remake, that essence was just gone. It was all surface, pretty costumes, CGI forests, but no soul. And that's why the film couldn't connect with audiences the way the original did." Jason paused for a moment, letting the weight of his words settle in before he continued. "You know, a big part of the magic of the original Snow White was her relationship with the dwarfs, the way they showed up for her even when things were grim. It wasn't just the plot that made that bond special, it was the heart behind it. In the new version, it felt rushed, forced even. It didn't have that same warmth. And without that emotional anchor, there's nothing for the audience to latch onto." The interviewer, clearly moved by Jason's perspective, asked, "So you're saying that Disney's attempt to modernize Snow White, by changing her into a more contemporary, independent character, undermined the emotional core of the story?" "Exactly," Jason said, his voice sharp. "What made Snow White so relatable was that she wasn't some superhero. She wasn't trying to fight her way through life. She faced adversity with kindness, with an unwavering belief that good would prevail. The modern version of Snow White, they took that core message and threw it out the window. It wasn't about hope or kindness anymore. It was about fighting, back, taking revenge on the Queen and proving herself. It wasn't the Snow White we all knew." Jason's expression hardened, his eyes narrowing slightly as he spoke with more conviction. "And that's where the emotional disconnect happened. The new Snow White became a figure of rebellion, and while that might resonate with some audiences, it didn't feel true to the character's origins. People wanted Snow White to inspire them with her goodness and purity, not with her anger or defiance. They wanted to feel uplifted, not frustrated." The interviewer nodded slowly, reflecting on Jason's words. "So the film's failure to capture that deep emotional connection with the audience ultimately led to its downfall." Jason's voice softened slightly, but his resolve remained unwavering. "It's not just about making a movie look good, it's about making people feel something. Snow White was never supposed to be about big action sequences or intense drama. It was about hope, love, and survival against all odds. And that's what people came to the theaters for. When Disney lost sight of that, they lost their audience." The interviewer glanced down at their notes, preparing to ask the next question, but it was clear the conversation was taking a new direction. Jason had hit the emotional core of the issue, the lack of depth, the missed opportunity to tap into the heart of the story. And that was the moment the film truly faltered. "Let's talk about the reception then," the interviewer continued, eager to keep the conversation flowing. "The movie has been panned by critics, but what about the fans? The audience's reaction has been mixed, but many people are vocal about feeling disappointed. Do you think Disney has completely lost touch with what audiences want?" Jason nodded slowly, as if considering the broader implications. "I think Disney has forgotten that their strength lies in nostalgia. People love the classics, and they want to see something that feels familiar, that brings back those feelings of wonder and joy. But when you try to force a square peg into a round hole, people can feel it. They know when a movie is trying too hard to be something it's not." He exhaled deeply, his gaze turning reflective. The movie's lack of emotional depth. It's not just about the audience not connecting with Snow White. It's about Disney not understanding what made their classics so beloved in the first place. It wasn't about spectacle or trends. It was about heart, honesty, and simplicity. And when you lose that, you lose everything. Jason sat back in his chair, his arms crossed tightly in front of him, as if he were preparing for the final act of a long battle. The truth is, Disney can't keep selling us these remakes with the same formula. They have to earn back the trust of the audience by staying true to the heart of these stories. If they don't, they'll continue to miss the mark. The room fell into a heavy silence. Jason's words had struck a chord with everyone present. The gravity of what he had said hung in the air like an unspoken truth. Snow White wasn't just a box office failure. It was a warning shot for Disney. If they didn't learn from this, they risked losing the very thing that had made them iconic in the first place, their ability to tell stories that touched the heart. The interviewer broke the silence, their voice quiet but firm. It sounds like Disney has a long road ahead if they want to rebuild their relationship with audiences. Jason nodded gravely. They do. But I hope they'll learn from this. Because in the end, it's not just about making money. It's about making magic. As the camera zoomed out and the lights dimmed, Jason's words lingered. The audience was left to reflect on the emotional weight of his message. Disney had a long way to go if it wanted to reclaim the magic of its past, starting with the stories, till it told in the heart that made them so unforgettable. The journey was far from over, but the lessons learned from Snow White would echo long into the future. "Stay tuned," the interviewer said, "for more insight into why Snow White became Disney's biggest live-action flop. It's not just about the movie, it's about the future of storytelling." Jason Statham's critique had hit the mark with brutal precision. The discussion that had started as a simple interview had turned into a damning dissection of Disney's live-action Snow White. As the show concluded, the waves of the conversation spread quickly. Social media buzzed with reaction. Fans of Disney's animated classic chimed in with their disappointment, and critics couldn't stop dissecting the film's flaws. The fallout from the film's failure wasn't just confined to Disney, it marked a larger moment of reckoning within the entertainment industry itself. In the days following the interview, Jason's blunt honesty about Snow White had become a hot topic. Headlines from across the entertainment world quoted his words, and even in Hollywood circles, the film's failure became a case study in what went wrong with modern remakes. Jason's perspective on the movie's lack of emotional resonance and its misguided attempt at modernization struck a chord with many. Inside the industry, murmurs of frustration were growing louder. Disney, which had once been the king of animated classics, had now struggled with a series of disappointing remakes. After the lackluster reception of The Lion King, Aladdin, and now Snow White, the studio's once unshakable reputation was starting to crack. The idea that Disney was merely trying to cash in on nostalgia rather than create something meaningful was beginning to take hold. At the center of this storm was Bob Chapek, the CEO of Disney, who had recently come under fire for a series of business decisions that many believed were out of touch with audiences. It was clear now that Disney's once magic formula, take a classic, add a touch of CGI, and update it for modern audiences, wasn't working. The live-action remakes had become more of a formulaic exercise than a reimagining of beloved stories. Jason, aware of the shifting tides in Hollywood, wasn't surprised by the fallout. "I knew this was coming," he said during a follow-up interview. "People love these classics, and you can't just slap a fresh coat of paint on them and expect to make a hit. You've got to dig deeper. If Disney wants to stay on top, they need to respect the heart of the stories they're adapting." In the wake of the film's failure, Disney faced some tough decisions. Would they continue to chase after the success of live-action remakes, or would they re-evaluate their approach to storytelling? For many, it seemed like the beginning of a crossroads moment, not just for Disney, but for the entire film industry. Snow White wasn't just a critical failure. It had implications for the broader Disney brand. The studio had built its reputation on timeless stories, but now it seemed to be losing its way. The notion that Disney could do no wrong by revisiting and reimagining classic stories was beginning to unravel. But it wasn't all doom and gloom. Despite the critical backlash, the movie still performed decently at the box office, though far below expectations. Snow White made money, but the return on investment was paltry compared to the astronomical budgets Disney had sunk into it. Fans were flocking to theaters, but they were doing so out of curiosity, not love for the new take on the story. That fact left Disney executives in a difficult position. On one hand, the revenue from Snow White still represented a decent return. On the other, it was clear that the audience's enthusiasm was waning. They weren't coming to the theater for a remake. They were coming out of nostalgia, but ultimately the film didn't live up to their expectations. The question now became, where did Disney go from here? Would they double down on the live-action remake trend, tweaking formulas and hoping for a hit, or would they return to their roots? In some of the closed-door meetings at Disney's headquarters, a sense of uncertainty began to creep in. The failure of Snow White wasn't just Disney's problem, it was symptomatic of a larger issue within the entire film industry. The focus on reboots, remakes, and sequels had taken a toll on originality. Hollywood had become obsessed with mining past successes, reinterpreting them for new generations, and hoping for repeat success. But in the process, the industry was losing the spark of creativity that had once made it the driving force behind global culture. Some industry insiders began to ask the tough questions. Why was the industry so reliant on reboots? Had the art of original storytelling been left behind? Were studios too afraid to take risks on new ideas, fearing they couldn't measure up to past successes? The flop of Snow White was a clear sign that audiences were becoming increasingly frustrated with this lack of originality. Jason was among those who saw this as an opportunity for change. Look, we've all seen the remakes and the reboots, they're fine, but at some point we need to return to storytelling that matters. That's what people are looking for. They want stories they can connect with, characters they can care about. We need to start taking risks again, not just playing it safe with nostalgia, and Jason wasn't the only one calling for a shift. Directors, actors, and writers across Hollywood echoed similar sentiments. The era of endless reboots was beginning to show its cracks, and the film industry needed to adapt if it wanted to survive. In the months following Snow White's release, Disney began to take stock of its options. After the criticisms of Snow White, it became clear that fans wanted a break from the endless stream of remakes. The studio, once synonymous with creative innovation, was now seen as the ultimate symbol of recycling. The brand that had pioneered the idea of animated classics seemed to have lost its way, but Disney wasn't ready to give up just yet. Inside the boardroom, conversations started turning toward revitalizing the studio's future, exploring new avenues, and returning to its roots of original storytelling. Would the studio continue down the path of remakes, or would it reinvent itself, drawing from its past successes while forging ahead with original content? In the wake of Snow White's failure, Disney faced a critical decision. Would they listen to the changing tastes of audiences, or would they continue to rely on the tried-and-true method of reimagining their classics? One thing was certain: the fallout from Snow White would be felt for years to come, but as with every great story, there was always the possibility for redemption. If Disney could find a way to balance nostalgia with originality, to tap into the heart of storytelling again, they might just be able to turn things around. The industry as a whole had reached a turning point. The question now was whether Hollywood would embrace a new era of creative storytelling, or whether it would continue down the same recycled path, hoping for a different outcome. Either way, the consequences of Snow White's failure had set the stage for the future of film, and the road ahead was uncertain. As Jason's interview had highlighted, the real magic in filmmaking wasn't in special effects, CGI, or marketing strategies. It was in the heart of the story. And if the film industry could find that heart again, perhaps the best stories had yet to be told. As the fallout from Snow White's failure continued to ripple across Hollywood, Disney found itself at a crossroads, forced to confront the harsh truths that had emerged from the misstep. With the emotional and financial impact of the film still fresh, the studio's leadership knew that the road to recovery wouldn't be easy, and the challenges ahead were immense. However, there was still hope. The right lessons could turn the ship around, and if Disney was willing to evolve, it could reclaim its spot at the top. Jason Statham's words had reverberated far beyond the interview room, sparking debate not only within the entertainment industry, but also among fans and critics. Everyone seemed to agree on one thing. Disney needed to rediscover the magic that had made it the cultural powerhouse it once was. That magic wasn't about flashy visuals or pandering to modern sensibilities. It was about heart, connection, and authenticity. Inside the walls of Disney's headquarters, executives began to gather for urgent strategy meetings. The team realized that the way forward wasn't by doubling down on the live-action remake trend. It was time to rethink their approach to storytelling entirely, to reimagine what it meant to build a modern Disney film. But the question remained, where would they begin? The first major change Disney decided to make was to truly listen to the voices of its audience. For too long, the studio had been relying on familiar formulas, recycling the same old stories and using the same approach to every remake. They had assumed that audiences would be satisfied with updated visuals and nostalgic references, but Snow White proved that this assumption was wrong. In a statement to the press, Disney's top executives acknowledged the misfire. "We understand that Snow White didn't live up to the expectations of our audiences, and for that we apologize. We hear you, and we are committed to finding ways to tell stories that resonate with both new and old generations. Our goal has always been to create magical experiences, and we are re-examining how we can do that more meaningfully. It was a step in the right direction, but words alone wouldn't be enough. Disney needed action. They needed to prove that they were serious about reconnecting with the audience and bringing back the emotional depth that had been lost." Jason Statham, who had become somewhat of an unofficial spokesperson for the anti-remake movement, continued to speak out in the press about the industry's over-reliance on nostalgia. "Nostalgia is powerful," he'd said in an interview, "but it's also a double-edged sword. If you keep relying on people's fond memories, eventually they'll feel cheated. They want something fresh. They want to see new stories unfold." Disney. Executives took Jason's comments to heart. The company's strategy meetings began to focus less on trying to revive old properties and more on developing original, groundbreaking films that would capture the magic of Disney's classic era. At the heart of the studio's new strategy was a desire to move beyond reboots and revisit the art of true storytelling. Disney knew it couldn't simply repeat the past. It had to evolve. The key was to find a balance between honoring the legacy of their past classics and embracing fresh, modern perspectives that could connect with today's audiences. The key takeaway from Snow White's failure was simple yet profound. Without emotional resonance, a movie couldn't succeed, no matter how dazzling its visuals or how famous its characters. Disney realized that the emotional connection audiences had once had with their films had been lost in the sea of over-processed remakes. Thus, the first order of business was to return to the basics. Disney needed to refocus on what made their stories timeless: strong, relatable characters, emotional depth, and an ability to make audiences laugh, cry, and think deeply about the messages woven into the narrative. There was no room for shallow portrayals or empty, surface-level characters. For the next wave of films, Disney promised that they would place a stronger emphasis on character-driven stories, ones that delved deeper into the human experience, with stakes that felt meaningful. Whether it was a classic fairy tale, a new fantasy world, or a contemporary drama, the studio vowed that the emotional core of each film would be the priority. One of the biggest changes in Disney's approach was bringing in new talent. The studio began seeking out fresh voices from different backgrounds, cultures, and experiences, voices that hadn't had a chance to shine in the traditional Disney mold. Disney acknowledged that diversity and inclusivity were vital to the future of storytelling, and that the voices of today's world needed to be reflected in the narratives they crafted. This shift led to the recruitment of new filmmakers, many of whom had already made names for themselves in indie films, TV series, and even theater. Their goal was to bring new perspectives to the screen, stories that felt authentic and grounded in the realities of today's society, while still maintaining the magic that Disney had become known for. "Disney has always been a place of imagination," said one new director on the team. But now we're going to push that imagination to include voices and experiences that haven't been told in mainstream films before. We believe in stories that resonate with people on a personal level, stories that make them feel something deep inside. As the months passed, Disney's new approach began to take shape. The studio announced a new slate of films that would reflect their renewed commitment to emotional depth, originality, and cultural inclusivity. These films would feature diverse characters, address relevant themes, and be built on the emotional core that had been missing from the recent remakes. One of the most anticipated projects was a live-action adaptation of an original fairy tale, one that had never been told before. It would feature a strong, relatable female lead, navigating a world filled with challenges but driven by hope and kindness. The film promised to capture the same heart and magic that had made Disney films beloved across generations. Additionally, Disney committed to creating animated films with modern themes, such as addressing environmental concerns, mental health, and the complexities of family dynamics. They wanted these films to be more than just escapist fare. They wanted them to spark meaningful conversations and offer audiences a chance to reflect on their own lives. Despite the failure of Snow White, Disney's commitment to change signaled hope for the future. The lessons learned from that film's failure would not be forgotten. If anything, they had sparked the beginning of a creative renaissance within the studio. It wasn't going to be an easy journey, and there would no doubt be more bumps along the way, but Disney was on the road to redemption. Jason Statham, who had been so vocal about the need for change, acknowledged that the road ahead would be challenging. It's not about erasing the past. Disney has a legacy that's worth celebrating, but they can't keep relying on the same formulas. They need to take risks, trust in new voices, and remember that storytelling is about connection, not just spectacle. The future of Disney was uncertain, but with new voices, a renewed focus on heart, and a commitment to moving away from the tired formula of reboots, the studio had a chance to rebuild its place in the hearts of audiences once again. The next chapter of Disney's legacy was waiting to be written, and only time would tell whether they would succeed in reclaiming the magic that had made them iconic, or if they would continue to struggle with their own identity. But one thing was clear. Change was coming, and Disney was ready to face the challenge. As the months rolled by, it became clear that the transition within Disney wasn't just a reaction to Snow White's failure. It was the beginning of a broader shift in how the entertainment giant approached storytelling. The industry had its eyes firmly fixed on Disney, waiting to see if the studio could pull itself out of the slump, or if it would continue to falter under the weight of nostalgia-driven reboots. But inside the walls of Disney's creative department, things were beginning to buzz with renewed energy. With fresh ideas circulating, new voices coming on board, and a clear desire to return to the heart of storytelling, the studio was ready for something groundbreaking. They had learned the hard way that superficial updates to old properties were no longer enough. It was time for Disney to rediscover the magic, not just of their old films, but of creating new worlds that could touch audiences in ways their classics had once done. It was during a high-stakes meeting in one of Disney's largest conference rooms that the seeds of change were first planted. The executives gathered around the table were ready to take a risk. There was an understanding that the next big project could either make or break Disney's attempt to redefine its brand. A bold proposal was put on the table, a movie that would fuse Disney's traditional love for fantastical, otherworldly tales with modern sensibilities and inclusivity. The project would be an original story, something that hadn't been done before. It would combine live action with animation in ways that had never been attempted, creating a hybrid narrative that was both visually innovative and emotionally impactful. The concept was met with both excitement and trepidation. Could Disney pull off a brand new story while still delivering the kind of magic audiences had come to expect? How could the studio address its recent mistakes while creating something fresh and innovative? Jason Statham, who had become one of the most outspoken critics of the remake trend, was offered a role in the new project. He was hesitant at first. His earlier comments had made him a divisive figure in Hollywood. However, after reading the script and meeting with the team, he saw the potential. It was different. It wasn't just another rehash of an old idea, it was a chance to do something truly new. "I'll admit I was skeptical at first," Jason later said in an interview about the project. "But when I read the script, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Excitement. This wasn't a safe bet. But that's what we need. We need to make movies that scare us a little, that make us think, that make us feel." This new project was still in its infancy, but its premise was already clear. It would be a story that emphasized diversity, emotional complexity, and a sense of wonder, all while keeping the core values of Disney, hope, love, and resilience, intact. Disney was planning to make a film that would be universally relatable, but also uniquely personal for audiences from all walks of life. The studio's renewed commitment to diversity was evident in this new project. For years, Disney had been under fire for a lack of representation in its storytelling. Although the studio had made strides with films like Moana and The Princess and the Frog, there was still much to be done in terms of inclusivity, especially in stories about characters from different cultural backgrounds. The new movie would center on a young girl from an underrepresented culture, living in a world that was divided by class, race, and tradition. It would touch on themes of identity, self-acceptance, and the journey toward empowerment. The studio wanted to avoid tokenism. This wasn't a movie about fitting diverse characters into a generic plot. It was about crafting an authentic experience that would allow every viewer, regardless of background, to see themselves in the story. It was clear that Disney was taking notes from its critics, acknowledging that the world had changed since the release of the Snow White remake. The demand for more diverse stories and authentic representation in film was no longer a trend. It was a movement. Audiences wanted to see characters who looked like them, whose struggles felt real, and whose journeys mattered. Jason's involvement in the film brought an extra layer of intrigue to the project. His career had mostly been built on high-octane action roles, but this was different. This film wasn't about fighting bad guys or saving the world. It was about real human connection, about learning to love and accept oneself in the face of adversity. For Jason, it was a chance to show a different side of his acting range. "I've always been drawn to roles that challenge me," Jason explained. "But this film isn't just about the character I'm playing. It's about the message we're sending out to the world. Say it's time we put real stories at the forefront, not just gimmicks." When the first teaser trailer for Disney's new project dropped, the reaction was overwhelming. Fans, critics, and industry insiders were all intrigued by what they saw. The ID's animation was stunning, blending traditional hand-drawn techniques with cutting-edge CGI to create a visually unique experience. The emotional depth of the trailer was palpable. This was a story that wasn't afraid to tackle real-world issues while still delivering the kind of heart that had made Disney films so beloved. For the first time in years, Disney seemed to have found a balance. The film wasn't a retread of the past. It was a bold step forward, embracing the future of storytelling while respecting the past. At the same time, the studio was careful to acknowledge the importance of Snow White's failure in this new venture. The decision to move away from endless remakes was deliberate and fueled by the lessons Disney had learned. They realized that true innovation came not from revisiting the past, but from having the courage to forge ahead into uncharted territory. As production progressed, Jason's presence on set became an important source of motivation for the entire cast and crew. His reputation for being direct yet deeply committed to his craft had a contagious effect on everyone around him. He wasn't just another actor trying to collect a paycheck. He was fully invested in ensuring that this film succeeded in every possible way. Jason's experience and perspective really helped guide the tone of the film, the director later commented. "He's been in the industry for decades, and he understands how to make something feel authentic, even if it's something fantastical." His input was invaluable in keeping the story grounded, no matter how grand the world became. Jason's dedication to the project went beyond acting. He worked closely with the filmmakers to ensure that the characters felt real, their struggles believable, and their victories earned. It was a departure from the typical big-budget action film he was known for, but it was exactly what the film needed: sincerity, heart, and a willingness to push the boundaries of storytelling. As Disney's new project began to take shape, it became clear that the studio was entering a new chapter, one of reinvention, of learning from the past and of pushing forward into uncharted territory. The world was waiting to see if Disney could rise from the ashes of Snow White's failure and become a leader in groundbreaking storytelling once again. For Jason, this project wasn't just another film. It was a chance to be part of something meaningful, a chance to prove that the real magic in filmmaking wasn't in special effects or in nostalgia. It was in creating stories that connected with people on a deep, emotional level. "I think the lesson here is clear," Jason said, in a final interview before the film's release. "It's not about the past, it's about the future. If we're going to tell stories that matter, we need to embrace the unknown. We need to create something that challenges us, something that resonates with people from all walks of life. That's how we move forward." As the release date approached, the world was watching. Would Disney's bold new direction pay off? Would this be the film to redefine Disney's future? Only time would tell. But one thing was certain: Disney's journey toward redemption was just beginning, and the magic of storytelling was alive and well once again. The buzz around Disney's new project continued to build, and the anticipation surrounding its release reached fever pitch. Critics, fans, and industry insiders alike were eager to see how Disney would address its recent missteps and whether it could deliver something truly special. The film was not only a test of Disney's creative abilities, but also an opportunity to reclaim its identity as the powerhouse of storytelling that had once captivated audiences worldwide. The studio had made a concerted effort to ensure that this project wasn't just another film. It was a symbol of Disney's renewed commitment to authenticity, diversity, and emotional depth. It had been a long road since the disappointment of Snow White, but now Disney was determined to show that it could evolve and thrive in a rapidly changing entertainment landscape. When the movie finally premiered, it was met with widespread acclaim. The film had everything that Disney fans had been longing for: a richly imaginative world, fully realized characters, and a storyline that struck an emotional chord with audiences of all ages. It wasn't a remake of an old classic. It was an original story that felt both timeless and fresh, filled with a sense of wonder and relevance to the world today. The film's heart-wrenching moments of struggle and triumph resonated deeply with viewers. The diverse characters portrayed with depth and care represented people from different walks of life, bringing their unique stories to the forefront. There were no stereotypes or superficial depictions here, only fully fleshed out individuals with hopes, dreams, and flaws. It was a celebration of what made people human, showcasing the strength that can be found in unity, kindness, and personal growth. Jason Statham, who had played a pivotal role in the project, received praise for his performance in a role that was a departure from the tough guy action roles he was known for. His portrayal of a flawed, yet deeply compassionate character was a standout, and it proved that his talent extended beyond his usual genre. Fans and critics alike were surprised by his ability to bring emotional depth to his character, something they hadn't seen from him before. "This is a different side of Jason that we haven't seen before," one film critic wrote. "His performance brings a level of vulnerability that adds layers to the film. It's clear he's fully embraced the heart of the story." But the film's success wasn't just about individual performances. It was about the collective effort of the entire cast and crew, who had worked tirelessly to make sure that every detail was perfect. The movie had a soul, and it showed. It wasn't just another Disney spectacle. It was a film that spoke to the heart of what Disney used to be about, a place where magic wasn't just created through special effects, but through emotional resonance. The real test came in the form of box office numbers. The stakes were high. After the disappointment of Snow White, Disney needed this film to succeed, not only to prove their creative vision, but to restore confidence in their ability to deliver hits. The numbers didn't disappoint. On opening weekend, the film raked in an impressive sum, surpassing expectations and quickly becoming a worldwide box office success. Audiences flocked to theaters, eager to see this new Disney creation that had sparked so much excitement. The film received rave reviews from audiences who praised it for its storytelling, emotional depth, and inclusivity. It was clear that Disney had struck the right balance between staying true to its roots while also embracing a new, more inclusive vision for the future. What made the box office performance even more remarkable was that it wasn't just Disney's typical audience of families and children who were showing up. Young adults, older audiences, and critics alike were all drawn to the film's powerful themes of self-discovery, personal growth, and the power of community. It was a movie that transcended age and cultural boundaries, speaking to a broad and diverse demographic. The success of this film was a crucial turning point for Disney, proving that audiences were hungry for more than just familiar stories. They were looking for fresh ideas that could spark their imaginations and touch their hearts in meaningful ways. With the film's success, it became clear that Disney had successfully navigated the challenging terrain of reinvention. The studio had learned valuable lessons from Snow White, and it was now ready to embrace a new era of storytelling. No longer would it be shackled by the need to recycle old material or rely on nostalgic formulas. Disney had rediscovered its magic, only this time it was magic that was grounded in authenticity and inclusivity. For Jason Statham, the film marked a personal and professional milestone. His involvement in the project had given him a new sense of purpose in his career, and he was grateful to be part of a film that was more than just a commercial success. It was a cultural moment. I've always believed that films can change the way people think, Jason reflected. And this one, it feels like we've made something that's going to stay with people. It's not just entertainment, it's something real, and that's why it matters. As Disney moved forward with new projects in the years that followed, the lessons learned from this film would shape the company's future. The renewed commitment to emotional storytelling, diverse representation, and original content would become the cornerstone of Disney's next chapter. The studio had learned from its mistakes, and now it was ready to build something truly special. In the years that followed, Disney would continue to innovate, producing films that not only entertained but inspired. Snow White would eventually be remembered as a turning point in the studio's history, a moment when Disney faced its failures head-on and emerged stronger and more determined than ever. The studio would continue to honor its past while forging a new path forward, one where creativity, diversity, and emotional depth were at the forefront of every story. The impact of this new era would be felt far and wide, as Disney once again became the gold standard for storytelling. The magic that had first captured the world's imagination was back, reimagined, yes, but still undeniably Disney. For Jason Statham, the journey had come full circle. He had entered the film industry known for his action-packed roles, but he would leave behind a legacy of transformation, not just for himself but for Disney as a whole. He had helped shape the turning point, contributing to a new wave of storytelling that would touch the lives of generations to come. As the credits rolled on this new chapter for Disney, one thing was certain: the magic was alive again, and this time it wasn't going anywhere.